Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all especially for joining us. Jenna, I'll start with you. You bring such poise and confidence to Victoria, but how easily did you find your way into who she is as this young woman?
It wasn't easy, and I think it's because I said to you earlier, I think when you approach somebody that not only is as iconic and as famous in our history, but it's somebody who is, her face is literally on coins and stamps and in portraits, and that project an image of who you think she is. So it's not until I read Daisy's scripts, and Daisy gave me loads of books to read, and I read her homework, and read her diaries, that these things kept jumping out at me that really kind of gave me an idea of the essence of her, because you're dealing with her diaries that have been edited, and you're also reading books that are from sources, so I guess in a way it's kind of, for me it was her sketchbooks, and she drew all these scenes of the opera, of like the most dramatic death or the most romantic moment, and I think for me that's Victoria at her most unedited is what she sketches.
I was so struck by that. I came across that in my research, and she was actually quite a great artist.
Yeah, I know. Again, something that I never knew about her, but you can see her sketches from being like 6 years old up to her in her 60s. It's incredible, and it's also what interests her. So what she chooses to draw, and often it's not pomp or hysteria. It's all there's a simplicity to it, and an honesty as well, I think.
Daisy Goodwin, you of course have written Victoria, both in your novel and on screen, as we just saw. And Jenna was just mentioning the diaries. What wealth of material, first of all, did you have to go through? I mean, it seems so unlikely that a leader would be, such a private leader would be so open, but she was, it seems.
Yeah, her diaries are wonderful. They're the diaries, you know, they start as the diaries of a teenage girl, and they get progressively more mature until she's really, there's one period in the 1860s after Albert's death where you can tell that she's obviously drinking quite a lot, because at the beginning her handwriting is very small and neat, and in the 1860s it's like this, you know, that's kind of the drops off the page. So they are extraordinary. I can't think of another, I mean there probably is, but I can't think of another monarch who's kept diaries so assiduously that are so interesting. Because I mean, George V kept, you know, diaries, but they're all like, got up, you know, went to Bognor, came back. But Victoria's diaries are brilliant because she's a natural writer. You know, she notices things. She's always noticing detail. And you know, the 3 years that where her diaries are completely unfettered because no one's reading them, her mother's not reading them, Albert's not reading them. So after she becomes queen and before she gets married to Albert, you know, it's this wonderful. She's like, they're basically all about Lord Melbourne. And it's like, Lord Melbourne says he doesn't like me in blue. Lord Melbourne doesn't like earrings, they're barbarous. Lord Melbourne and I looked at Dashy, and we looked at the way he lapped from his bowl and stuff like that. And it just goes on, and Lord M says this, Lord M says that. And they are the most sort of enchanting record of a sort of teenage crush, actually. So I highly recommend them if you're interested in Victoria. They're all online, and you can actually, yeah, you can just dial them up, and they're well worth reading. They're very entertaining.
Rebecca, I'll ask you about your personal diaries in a moment, but but before we leave that, Jenna, what most struck you about her personality? What cracked open in her personality through those observations that you were talking about in those diaries?
Just how candid she is, and unapologetic. And if she believes she is right, that is it. She's incredibly stubborn, and I love that about her.
I have to say, we just had an interview for Open Studio too, and I apologize for repeating some of the questions, but where do you see how she got that conviction? Because we saw in last season how she was somebody who was so contained, and she didn't have a lot of exposure to the outside world, certainly to political systems, it would seem, and yet seemingly overnight, she gets this confidence. She becomes this woman. She has the wherewithal to take ownership and be as candid as she seems.
I think I'd be interested what you think. I think she's always had it, but I've always had an interesting thing of what's nature versus nurture, and there was something I read about her father when she was born called her a pocket Hercules because she was this very determined toddler, and but yet you do think, given the way in which she grew up and the Kensington system and how much she had to really rally against her mother and against people manipulating her, I suppose, and trying to control her, is that this kind of this iron and this steel in her which kind of went throughout her life, if that's really where it came from, or if it's because she was 4'11" and she was a woman and she was a woman of power in that time, and is that where it came from? But I do think it was something she was absolutely born with, and it really got.
I think you know, there are a couple of things about her childhood. Like when she was 4, she told her mother she wasn't going to speak German at home. She was going to speak English. So by the age of 4, she knew that it was not a good political move to be speaking with a German accent. And then I think the other great, fascinating thing about Victoria is that as a child, she was always known as Drina because her first name was Alexandrina. And it's only when she gets to the throne and they're saying, well, what are we going to call you? You're going to be called Elizabeth or Anne or one of these kind of queenly names. She says, no, I'm going to be called Victoria. And Victoria was not a name then. I mean, now it's a name that, you know, it's a really famous name, but then it was not a name. There was nobody in England called Victoria. So it was like she'd made up her own name, you know. It's like being Queen Beyonce. I mean, it's a really extraordinary sort of revelation. And I think that, you know, she chose this name in a sort of nominative self-determinism. You know, Victoria, victory, she'd won out. You know, she was queen. She'd got through her ghastly childhood, and now she'd won, and she was queen. Victoria. And I think it, you know, that set the tone for her reign, actually. So I think she had a very keen sense of her own brand, Victoria. And you have to say that about her, that, you know, you can argue about how much influence she had over the 19th century, but, you know, by goodness, she named it, didn't she? The Victorian era. That's what we call it. And so, you know, I think she won out in that respect too.
Rebecca, or should I say Queen Rebecca in this room, that's how she's known in these parts. You, from what I heard, you were deliberately looking for a show that could be, serve as a role model to young women. Is that true, first of all?
No.
Even if it was true, she would not tell me it was true.
No, well, sort of. I think with Downton, we realized that there were lots of young women who were coming to watch it who might not have before. They had sort of thought Masterpiece Theatre was for their grandparents, their parents, but they realized, actually, this is about forbidden love. It's about great frocks. This is fun. So they turned up in droves at the same time that social media kind of turned up in droves. So we did realize this is a great new audience. When you're always looking for new, younger audiences, always. But I didn't necessarily go shopping for what's the next thing that young women would like. I overheard a conversation about Victoria in a restaurant in New York, not about Queen Victoria, but about the fact that there was going to be a television series. And so I rushed home and dialed the people who were making it and said, we'd like to co-produce this, whatever it is, whoever this Daisy person is. And, so instantly wanted to do it, not because it was, oh great, it's about young women, but because it's just a great story. It's 60 years of a life and a marriage and a sex life and power. It's iconic, and it hadn't ever been done. We think of Queen Victoria as the little lady with the tea cozy on her head, you know, but the young, attractive woman was not something anybody knew about. So we did it, and then the young women showed up, and we have been staying in touch with them via social media successfully. And it's great because it's not just a silly romance. I mean, you know, this girl was powerful.
And I'm curious as to how you all see the show right now, where moment to moment, the world is changing as it relates to women and power in women. And here we're seeing a show about a woman who had absolute power and knew how to interpret it and use it and be confident about it.
She did, but equally, I think she was also a product of her time, and she didn't believe women should have the vote, which is what I find is very interesting about Victoria.
Well, but that's the point about her. Because she didn't need the vote, you know, so it didn't occur to her that anyone else would. I mean, but all her daughters, interestingly, were very keen suffragists. They all wanted the vote, and I think if Victoria hadn't been queen, she would definitely have wanted the vote. But you have to think that having a woman on the throne who manages both to be queen and to be married and to have 9 children must have changed the way that people thought about women in the 19th century. Because if you think about it, at the beginning of her reign, they've got no rights at all. I mean, women in England are their husband's property. And by the end of the reign, you know, they can have jobs, they don't have the vote, but they've got self-determination. And that is an enormous difference. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you've got a woman as head of state. You know, so you can't pretend that women are incapable of doing things and having children, because you've got a queen doing it. I mean, the sovereign has no gender, but the fact that you've got a woman sort of at the heart of public life who's the boss, I think must have changed the way that people thought about women. And so I think that, you know, so she may not overtly have been a feminist, but I think the fact that she was there made sure that, you know, the cause of women was served throughout that time.
How do we see in this season, does she deal with her pregnancy? We get hints of what motherhood means. What we saw at the end of last season, that she's...
I think the thing about Victoria, one of the things I love about Victoria is that she's the most unsentimental mother. I mean, there's no doubt that she loves her children, but she's not soppy about them. I mean, she calls little babies, she said, they look like frogs. All the way that their limbs shake about, she hates that. And she thinks she really doesn't get to like them until they're sort of toddlers. But you know, people have called her a bad mother, but she's not a bad mother. She's just, if she was a man, you know, if she was a king and she behaved like that, you wouldn't call him a bad father. It's because she's a woman, we expect her to be all gooey about her kids. But, you know, as she writes to her daughters, when her daughters start having babies, she writes to them, she says, don't, you know, get lost in the nursery, girls, because that's, you know, the ruin of many an intelligent young woman. And I don't know, I think that's pretty good advice, actually.
With great resentment.
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, and of course the other poor Victoria, you know, she loves sex, but she had no contraception. So, you know, 9 children, that's what you get, basically.
Tell the story about the bedroom door.
Oh, okay. So one of the things I find very charming about their relationship, Victoria and Albert's relationship, is that Albert thinks of everything. So, and when he designs Osborne House, which is the house that they build on the Isle of Wight, which is a kind of, it's sort of by the seaside, and it's this beautiful sort of Italian villa, and he designs everything, you know, the taps, the this, the that, including this special thing in the bedroom. So basically, when Victoria and Albert get into bed, he can, you know, and they want to get it on, he can just lean over and with one touch of a button, he can lock the bedroom door. So they can't be disturbed because, you know, otherwise there's servants and children and dogs running in and out. And I mean, that's attention to detail, isn't it? That's German engineering at its finest. Yeah.
Jenna, are you prepared to have 9 babies on set?
Honestly, I don't know how we're going to make the show. And I sincerely mean that. It's absolute chaos.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the end of Christmas where we finished off. We had 3 babies and one on the way. And often they're twins for working hours. So it's a case of quick, the other twin isn't in shot, quickly shoot something. Or we have the parents dressed up as nursemaids or the grandparents or hiding behind pillars holding bags of Doritos, which apparently is a trick that seems to work. Bertie would only stay on the rocking horse, so you may notice like nearly every single scene he's just constantly on this rocking horse. But yeah, it really is a challenge. And then we throw in dogs,
Yep.
Daisy likes to throw in Shetland ponies here and there. What's next?
Never work with children and animals.
I kept wondering how poor Dash is going to do with babies in the household.
Yeah, no, Tori likes Tori likes the attention actually. But that's what's really hilarious is because they all love, it's like a play, obviously it's like a playground, and all the kids love playing with each other. So the scenes that make me laugh are, you know, when Victoria returns home and she's like, "Oh, darling," and they all look at me like, I'm supposed to come running up to Mama, and no, they're too busy with like the puzzle game that they're playing.
So we've mentioned romance here, but I'm wondering about the romance we're not talking about as much with Lord M, who we saw a lot of in last season. Is there any chance that he'll resurface in season 2? Of course, played by Rufus Sewell, Lord Melbourne.
Ooh. Well, yeah, I think we can say that he will be resurfacing.
That's it. What can we say?
Resurfacing.
First of all, you don't want us to tell you anything, do you? No. See, they don't really want to know.
Oh, okay.
But you do know that he died because they all died eventually. So that.
Rebecca.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Rebecca.
No, I mean she died too, but you know, not this season.
Okay. Right. Okay, moving on.
Before we ask about Victoria and Albert, what was the nature of that relationship between Victoria and Lord M?
Oh, well, if you read the diaries, it's like the world's biggest crush. He was the first man, he was the first man she'd ever been alone with in a room, you know, because she was so carefully chaperoned that up until that point she'd never been alone with a man before. And then, you know, the first man she's alone in a room with is Lord Melbourne, who's like famously one of the most attractive men in Europe. So, hello. And you can just, you know, as you just go through her diaries, you can just tell that, you know, she starts off a little bit suspicious because she doesn't know what his agenda is, and then, you know, about 3 weeks later, it's like, Lord M said this, Lord M said that, and, you know, Lord M says I shouldn't, I asked Lord M if he thought I was putting on weight, and Lord M said yes, he did think I was putting on a bit of weight. And
He also told her a bath once a week is...
Yes, he thought that she was a bit smelly. Yes, we left that bit out. So they had a very frank relationship, but they obviously got on incredibly well. They're always joking, and you know, her diaries are, I mean, they're just the most wonderful record of this kind of extraordinary friendship. And I think he was undoubtedly her first love, and I think she was his last love, basically, because there's, you know, he'd had this very tragic life. His marriage had failed, and he'd been, the year before Victoria comes to the throne, he'd been in a lawsuit about having an affair with a married woman called Mrs. Norton. It was called a criminal conversation. You know, they'd got the Prime Minister in court, and he was acquitted. But I think he was lonely. His son had died. He was lonely, and then suddenly, you know, he was quite bored of being Prime Minister, and then suddenly Victoria comes along, and at last he's got somewhere to focus his affection. And I think that's what he did. And they were, you know, for 3 years, they were everything to each other, I think.
And I heard that you had a great time with Rufus Sewell, which
Yes.
must be very good to be friends, to have that kind of chemistry that you have to find.
Yes, it's very funny to me that, I mean, obviously I can totally understand it, how, you know, everybody is very charismatic and on the screen very smouldering, but he really is the biggest geek off screen. Like, we're totally ridiculous and giddy and stupid, and I'm pulling stupid voices and faces, and then, you know, so it's very, he's a lot of fun to work with and very generous.
He switches it on, doesn't
Yeah.
he, Rufus? Yeah.
How is it to be in those clothes? Do they help you to find the character? And they look, I have to say, despite what Lord M might say, they look very constricting.
Yeah, they do. They obviously the costumes and the sets, they all help. It's very interesting trying to maneuver over a runway because our set is literally in an airport. So you go from your trailer, which is on a runway, and you cross the runway in costume to then enter an airport hangar, which is then Buckingham Palace. So the contradiction of those two things are very funny.
All of the interiors. I always just
Yeah.
assumed you were shooting in a palace.
No,
somewhere.
we're literally in an airport hangar. There are planes on the runway.
Really?
Yeah.
And there are birds nesting up in the, flying around up in the rafters.
Yeah, the birds like to interrupt at, like, you know, the moment where Victoria's about to ask Albert to marry her. You suddenly get these birds. They seem to know when the most dramatic moment's going to be. So then it becomes such a task to not fall about laughing. It's like a rainforest in there.
David Attenborough will be in there next year.
Yeah.
And are the clothes as she would have worn? Are they as tight? Are they as?
The corsets, I think, and I think maybe it's because I've worn one every day for 7 months while shooting, so I feel quite close to how a Victorian woman must have felt. But I cannot believe psychologically what they do, because especially playing someone like Victoria, who is passionate and impulsive, and it's like if you feel like you want to run down the corridor, you can, but then you can't breathe, or if you're feeling emotional, it changes everything, because your chest, it's literally like someone is telling you don't run and walk and stand in a certain way. And I think psychologically for women at that time, it's really interesting.
That's a really interesting point. And yes, because they can't breathe, you know. So
it dictates how you.
That's why they're always fainting, of course, you know, because they literally couldn't breathe. A bit of emotion and then off. Yeah.
Did she just give them up later in life? When I think Judi Dench recently described her as being as wide as she was tall.
I think she put on a few pounds later in life. God bless her. And I think she gave up the corsets shortly after Albert's death. I mean, up until Albert's death, she was pretty good, and I mean, you know, she didn't put on a lot of weight. And then after Albert's death, she just started to, you know, eat all the pies and drink all the whiskey. Her favourite tipple was whiskey mixed with red wine.
Oh.
Yeah. So there you go. Yeah. Don't try that at home, folks.
I assume you're not the method actor drinking whiskey and red wine.
Who knows? I might be the method actor not wearing the corset.
Yeah. It sounds wise. What about Blair Castle in Scotland? Is that someplace that you did shoot? Because
we shot there and they went there. So that was really brilliant for us, because it was I think that's the first location where we didn't have to recreate it ourselves. And we were actually in the place where Victoria and Albert went, and it was amazing, wasn't it?
Their bed is still there, like the furniture that they actually used for their stay is still there, and Victoria hand wove a basket that she gave to them as a gift, and so we got to see all of these, and so many letters. To stand in the rooms where they actually came, they wrote about their time. It was amazing to film there.
Does that change how you feel about performance that day, to be there, to not literally find the ghosts, but to know that they were there in some capacity?
Absolutely, absolutely. I love, I mean, it's like any visit to Kensington Palace or Windsor Castle, and you know, you can touch banisters and think, oh, this is the moment, you know, when she was first announced Queen, she probably touched this banister before she walked in to speak to the Privy Council at 18 years old. It makes it all very real. It is real.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to England, if you go to London, there are lots of places you can go where Victoria was, and you can touch the things and see the things. Especially the exhibition at Kensington Palace, it's wonderful, because you see Victoria's wedding dress. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. So,
Rebecca, I know you get this question a lot, and why is it that people respond so much, especially to the monarchy? And I was thinking about this, that even in my lifetime, I've seen their popularity come and go. But this show, as I think John or you mentioned, has done extraordinarily well here in the United States. And I think there's exceptional happiness about the monarchy now with the new engagement.
Well, I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and I should know, you know, for all these years of British drama, and I don't know, except I think it has something to, first of all, I think it's largely women who have this complete addiction to the monarchy, because we are all raised to think we're going to become a princess, at least, if not a queen. Not raised, but we just sort of get that. Most little girls do that. I happen to remember being about 10 or 11 years old and being absolutely convinced that Prince Charles was going to find me and marry me. I really did think I was going to be the first American. He was going to somehow come to Pasadena, California and find me. But I do think it's fairy tales, it's ultimate aspirational perfect life, or it looks that way, to have everything and to dress that way. And for men, I suppose it's power, ultimate power of, being a monarch. And so many of the stories are so visual. They're just so visual and so rich. I mean, Henry had 8 wives, Then you have the King Edward VIII, and that whole drama of forbidden love. And so it echoes on and on and on. I think for Americans, also, we are so forward-looking. We have to go out and settle this continent. And I would say the British revere their pasts and look backwards. Not that they're not forward-thinking in lots of ways, but just love to honor what they have had. And so Anglophilia makes it across the Atlantic and is, thank God, alive and well in this country.
I just have one more quick question before we turn it over to audience questions. I'll give you fair warning. We'll have about 15 minutes for your own questions, so you can think of them now. But Jenna, I'm wondering if there's one part of Victoria that you most appreciate when you come to work each day, that you most enjoy playing, or part of her personality, or what you really relish about her.
I think her immediacy, maybe. She's quick to react, quick to say what she thinks, quick to, I enjoy, she's reactive. She's incredibly reactive, and I really enjoy that. As Daisy said earlier, the fact that she isn't sentimental as such, or the perfect mother as one would, the conventional mother perhaps as one would put it. I think that's incredibly interesting about her. But I think she's also, she contradicts herself all the time, and to try and get a handle on that and a grapple of that is really fun.
And so now it's time for your questions, and I think there are people on either side with microphones. There's one just to the left here.
Jenna, I just want to admire your riding, that tight corset, side saddle, galloping along. Did you do your own riding?
I did, other than, I'm just trying to think what you would have seen. Oh, I did, actually.
Almonzo.
Almonzo, my dear horse who likes to lead me. Actually, that day, he kept not wanting to turn around because he knew if he went down the hill, he wouldn't have to do the scene again. But my horse he's a show horse, so he likes to Spanish walk and do all sorts of tricks while I'm on him when he gets bored on set. But I love it. I do love riding.
Jenna's being very modest. She learnt to ride for Victoria. So, she gets... Yeah.
Thank you. I keep asking Daisy to not make me pregnant all the time so I can ride more.
Get back on the horse, yeah.
Hi, over here. To me, other than it being a great story with great acting, I thought it was, what I found and connected with the most was just how understated it was. How you just used 1 or 2 words or a sentence, a facial expression, the music, and yet all those things together is where the power was. And I keep thinking that must have been so hard to do. Like, it seemed effortless, and to me it's what really made the show fantastic, but it must have been really hard. Do you understand what I'm saying? To convey such power with so little.
Oh, well, I'm thrilled that you think so. I think possibly that's a result of a lot of really good script editing, and also the fact that my scripts are incredibly long and they all got cut to ribbons, So often there'll be some wonderful speeches that I wrote that have been rightly got rid of, so we've just left with a look. But actually, it's interesting that you say that, because this is my, Victoria. I hadn't written for the screen before Victoria. And so I learnt a lot as I went along, and one of the things I've learnt is that actually a really good script, it's only half of it's on the page, only half of it's in the words. The real magic comes in the playing. And when you've got someone like Jenna or Tom or Rufus, they often you know, they don't need the lines, they just need the look or the feeling, and that's all you want. Although I have to say there are some terrible double entendres in the show, which you know, sometimes I think, oh my God, did I really write that? But I think, oh well, I think actually. There's I can't remember, there are so many, but I remember the screening of the first episode in London, and there was some really filthy titters after one particular line. I can't remember, what was it? It was something that we were all...
An episode,
yes.
I feel like it was something to do with the telescope, but I'm not
Yes,
sure.
it was either a telescope or... I remember writing Albert Goes when he's looking at a model of Big Ben. Oh, what a wonderful and what a magnificent erection. And... It's one of those things I wrote perfectly innocently, and everyone going, no. But luckily, so my worst excesses get edited out. But I'm so pleased you think that it's understated. That's a huge compliment. Thank you very much.
Right here in the front, too.
First of all, Victoria is very, very well done, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And I'm sort of looking around for a Victoria's Secret, and that is there or was there a scene which was very challenging for you, one of the hardest, say, in the first episode that challenged you and you really had to think about doing it rather than having it come, say, automatically to you?
In the first episode of the whole...
In the beginning of Victoria, the first that we've seen.
I think the hardest, I can't really think of a particular scene, but things like the coronation, like how much do you give away? How much is she playing the role of a queen and you can't see anything, but yet, you know, when you read her diaries, it was like the proudest day of her life, and actually she is just this young girl. So you're always kind to try to marry up, like in the beginning, the young, naive girl and the wise queen, and youth and power, and she's got this kind of this frankness and yet this whimsical nature as well. And so she's constantly, it's kind of marrying up these opposing things all of the time, is what I found. And also how open and human to be when she's at her day job, I suppose. It was I remember a lot of my initial questions.
This question is for Queen Victoria. I read that...
How I answer.
I read that in obtaining a previous role that you won the role because you spoke faster than the lead male.
Yes.
And how much attention was paid to getting the cadence of Queen Victoria's voice in the television show? Did you know what her cadence was? I mean, it was in times past, but was there an attempt to work that right?
I looked at a voice recording of Victoria, which they do have, and you can barely make it out.
You can't hear anything. It's just a scratch.
It's like a scratch, and then you hear, and it's tiny. So that's, I mean, obviously we have no voice, we have no videos. Oh, in fact, there is one, isn't there, of her laughing?
Yes, there's some film of her laughing. Everyone always said she had that her voice was her most beautiful feature.
Yeah.
Clear, bell-like, and pellucid.
Pellucid, great word. So we didn't particularly have anything to go off other than we wanted something that felt regal, but not alienating. So it's very accessible, and we could move in between public and private very easily.
So we didn't go the route that The Crown went, where they have such clipped upper class accents that my daughter actually had to watch it with the subtitles on because she didn't understand what they were saying.
Emily Blunt in The Young Victoria actually is was a great reference.
Yeah, she did well.
There's a question right in the back.
Thank you. My favorite part of Victoria was when Albert was riding the train, and Victoria was so surprised, and she rides it and she likes it. I was wondering if Victoria was interested in this science or inventions or new upcoming theories that Albert was, but I don't know about Victoria.
Well, I think she wasn't quite as interested as Albert, because who was? But I mean, he was pretty much, you know, the Steve Jobs of the royal family. But she was passionate about photography, interestingly, and both she and Albert became the first patrons of the Photographic Society, and in 1849, so very, very early. And she and Albert were the first royals to be photographed. And what's so interesting about the photograph of them is that, you know, up until then, can you imagine, up until then, all her people have seen of Victoria is, you know, paintings where she's wearing a crown, you know, she's in the sort of full, you know, in her uniform, or engravings of these paintings. And then suddenly they see a photograph of her wearing a kind of a bonnet and a shawl and looking just like one of them. And that was an extraordinary moment. It was revelatory, I think, for the people of Britain, because suddenly, you know, the royal family had become human. And I think it was that Victoria's willingness to be photographed, actually, which was one of the real secrets of the royal family's longevity, because they weren't afraid of the media. They sort of embraced it. And the fact that the people could see her, see that she was one of them, I think made a huge impact, because suddenly everybody thought, they didn't think of her as an aristocrat anymore. They thought of her as a middle-class mother. And you know, and the same thing has happened with our Queen today, you know, that they're both very skillfully managed to portray themselves as ordinary women, when of course they're, you know, fabulously rich and live in palaces and have thousands of servants and whatever. But, you know, they look like they're just like us, you know. And that's the secret of, I think, of the royal family's enduring appeal.
And we have time for just one last question. I think right down here in the center. You've been very patient. I've seen your hand up.
Hi, I was interested in what plot development they were going to do with Mrs. Scarrett. I've been very intrigued by that storyline.
Well, I don't know what I can say, but, well, I'm glad you're intrigued by it. I think we're going to see more of Mrs. Scarrett, so that's good. I don't want to say any more because I don't want to spoil it for you, but I have a lot of fun writing her because, of course, there was a Mrs. Scarrett. I'm afraid I've completely made her up as a character. But what's interesting about her is that she's a young woman like Victoria, but she lives in a complete, you know, she comes from a completely different class, and for her, marriage is not an opportunity. It's a sort of, it's a sentence, you know, and she's very ambiguous about that. And she has, by working for the Queen, she has her own independence, and so she has she has to kind of decide what is it that she wants, and that's why at the end of season 1, she decides not to go off with Francatelli, and then, you know, she changes her mind and it's too late. So I think she's an interesting character, and they're both, you know, I wanted to kind of get away from the idea of Victorian heroines always being waiting for a man to, you know, ask them to marry them. You know, what I love about Victoria and Scarrett is they're really the ones calling the shots. So that's why I hope they're, you know, inspirational for young women everywhere.
Well, Daisy Goodwin, Jenna Coleman, Rebecca Eaton, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.